Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Amy, and we appreciate you tuning in. In our podcast, we review and provide commentary on resources, literature, and we discuss issues related to the field of speech-language pathology.
You can use this podcast for ASHA professional development. For more information about us and certification maintenance hours, you can go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. SLP Nerdcast is brought to you by listeners like you. You can support our work by going to our website or social media pages and contributing. Every little bit counts. You can also find permanent products, notes, and other handouts, including a handout for this episode. Some items are free, others are not, but everything is always affordable. Check us out and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on Instagram or Facebook or email us anytime at info@slpnerdcast.com.
So just a quick disclaimer. The contents of this episode are not meant to replicate clinical advice. SLP Nerdcast, its hosts, and guests do not represent or endorse specific products or procedures that may be mentioned during our episodes unless otherwise stated. We are not PhDs, but we do research our material. We do our best to provide a thorough review and fair representation of each topic that we tackle. That being said, it's always likely that there's an article we've missed or another perspective that we haven't shared. If you have something to add to the conversation, please email us. We'd love to hear from you.
Before we get into today's topic, the big brother and powers that be require us to read our financial and non-financial disclosures. We feel like our intro is just getting longer and longer, and we're trying really hard to keep it short. So financial disclosures, I am the owner and founder of Grand Bois Therapy and Consulting, LLC. I'm also co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. Amy is an employee of a public school system and also co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. Our non-financial disclosures, we are both members of ASHA SIG 12. We serve on the AAC Advisory Group for Mass Advocates for Children. I am a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy, otherwise known as BABIT. I'm also a member of MassABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and the corresponding Speech-Language Pathology and Applied Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group. So many words. It's like a word pile.
We made it though, and if you guys are still here, you made it too, so thanks for that.
Yes, and here we are together. What are we talking about today, Amy?
So today we're talking about assessments, and we're really focusing today on non-standardized components of assessment here, and particularly non-norm referenced.
So we talked about this a little bit in a previous episode, our previous episode on standardized assessments, and there was a lot that we couldn't get to. So we wanted to make sure that we covered some more of the nitty-gritty in a separate episode where we had more time to unpack a whole bunch of different things. This whole conversation about standardized assessments really got started because a listener, I told you, we love hearing from our listeners. It gives us so much to think about. It gives us more things to write about. So a listener sent us this really great question. And the question was that this individual was in private practice or starting a private practice and had been asked to do an assessment, but didn't have access to any standardized tests. And the question was, can she still do the assessment? Could she still do the assessment without standardized measures? So it was sort of another way of asking that question was, are standardized assessments a requirement? Standardized assessments are so commonly used by speech and language pathologists culturally. They're like a cornerstone of the assessments that we do. So Amy and we've sort of started unpacking that question and of course went into the literature, and we read one article and that made us read another article, and then we wrote an episode and that made us write another episode. So here we are, episode 2 about standardized assessments. But this episode is slightly separate from the other one in terms of covering different content, still discussing assessment in general. So what are our learning objectives, Aim?
So we are going to cover a lot of pretty interesting stuff today. Our first learning objective is looking at stating the 3 potential functions of a comprehensive assessment. And as you'll learn, there are actually more than 3. Our second learning objective will cover describing the difference between a norm referenced and criterion referenced assessment. Those are both standardized assessments, but different. And our final learning objective number 3, is going to be being able to identify at least 3 components that should be considered within a comprehensive assessment.
And when we were writing this episode, I just want to take a minute to highlight the word comprehensive assessment, because I think in our field, and having worked in a variety of different work settings, when you're asked to do an assessment, there are so many different quote norms. So I've worked in places where I was given a 2-page checkbox form, and that was my assessment. I've worked in places where I was asked to write, a 7 to 10-page narrative, and I was also told I had an hour to write it. You
I think I worked
know?
in places similar to that as
Which
well.
was, I believe you worked in the same place. Maybe you just didn't have to write the assessments. These assessments, they're sort of like, they drive our treatment. They're a cornerstone of what we do, and yet they're the biggest, you know, PITA, pain in the ass.
Yeah.
They can really just get you down if you don't know what you're doing. So I think when we were writing this episode, the term comprehensive assessment, I think is a great way to standardize how to think about assessments across all those different formats, across the different, expectations of your work setting, check boxes, narratives. Our assessment process should be comprehensive.
That is a perfect segue into our first learning objective. State 3 potential functions of a comprehensive assessment.
So I think this learning objective is interesting because I've never thought of assessments as having quantitative number of functions. So I am very excited and interested to go through this.
Yeah, and we may have missed some of the functions, but I think when we step back and think more about our assessment process, because I agree with you, I've worked in a lot of different settings and environments, and what that process looks like is different everywhere. But what our process as a clinician should be, I think, is, before you even undertake your assessment, really thinking about, well, why am I doing it? Right. So, number one is going to apply to everybody. And number one brings us to our ASHA Code of Ethics, right? So, when our ASHA Code of Ethics tells us in Principle 1K, individuals who hold the certificate of clinical competence shall evaluate the effectiveness of services provided, technology employed, and products dispensed, and it literally says evaluate.
Right.
Like,
Exactly. So, like, why are you evaluating in the first place? Why does it need to be comprehensive? Because your code of ethics says so. You can't evaluate the effectiveness of treatment without some sort of measurement and assessment.
right. And I mean, I think if we think about Principle 1A, individuals shall provide all clinical services and scientific activities competently, assessment has got to be part of that.
Right. I mean, in terms of, and I think that the word competently is a really interesting, and this is sort of goes back to our listener's question. So, could she write an assessment that was a competent assessment without standardized assessment measures?
Right.
Um, and I think the idea of clinical services and scientific activities being done competently really also hooks back to the idea of doing an assessment that's comprehensive. So, you're doing an assessment that is comprehensive because your assessments are driving your treatment, because you need to evaluate areas of strength and areas of need to help design your learning your measurable goals and objectives on an IEP, on an insurance form, no matter where it is you work. And you can't really do that without a comprehensive assessment.
Right. So, one reason that we know that we're doing these comprehensive assessments is because our ethical code tells us.
Hmm.
But why does it tell us that, sort of, right? Like, why is that part of the ethical code? And you touched on a lot of these, because it's important in order to do lots of different things. You may find that in your work setting, another reason a comprehensive assessment is used is to determine eligibility, right? So when we're thinking about assessments, comprehensive assessments, making and informing eligibility determinations, that may identify a need in general, just that there is a need, as well as you may need to hit specific criteria for eligibility that could be determined by different stakeholders like government agencies, your practice guidelines, right, in your institution, which could be checklist guidelines or could be, write a comprehensive eval, including all these components. Um, as well as, you may have eligibility that's tied to third party funding source.
And I think that, we touched on this in our last episode a lot. This idea of eligibility might be a great time to use a norm referenced assessment, because a norm referenced assessment is comparing the performance of an individual to a norm referenced a sample of individuals, norm referenced sample. And it's going to tell you how that individual performed in comparison to that norm reference sample. So if you're looking to do an assessment for eligibility, you might need those numbers, right? This is why with my students, so I work with individuals who are, emergent communicators and they're 15. When I give them the PPVT, am I really looking at their age equivalency, or am I doing it because I need to continue to establish eligibility for special education services? There's a really important role there for standardized assessments. And as we discussed in a previous episode, I said standardized assessments, I meant norm referenced assessments. As we discussed in a previous episode, the purpose of a norm referenced assessment is really, that's pretty much where it, not totally where it ends, but norm referenced assessments are only going to get you so far.
Well, and I think even being aware that what makes you eligible can be very institution specific. So I think that that's important awareness to have as a clinician and also to communicate with your clients. I've worked in places in the country where in order to be eligible for public school services, you need to be 2 to 2.5 standard deviations below the mean, maybe on at least two different norm reference measures, right? But that doesn't
Mhm.
mean that that same client couldn't go to perhaps an outpatient environment or a private practitioner and still be eligible. It could still be very appropriate for them to receive a service. They just didn't meet the eligibility criteria of that specific institution. Um,
Such a good point.
so I think being aware of that and the idea that those are things that, again, aren't really fixed, just like the idea of what is a comprehensive assessment isn't really fixed. And then the other component of eligibility is for discharge, right? So a lot of the folks who I work with may receive services for a prolonged period of time, but that's not the case for every client. That's not the case for every population. That's not the case for every institution. So, in some places, such as a public school, you would need to test to indicate that the service is no longer warranted. You just can't end a service because you decide.
Mhm.
So we've got our code of ethics, we have eligibility. Those two things are important. Another thing we might use comprehensive assessment for is this piece that you were talking about, which is incredibly relevant, which is that assessment should inform your treatment.
That's the whole point, right? I think there might be other reasons why people would get assessment, but you can't really do informed treatment without an assessment of some sort. Even if it's an informal assessment and evaluative treatment, you are evaluating and measuring a skill in order to guide specific measurable goals and objectives,
Right.
always.
Right. And in the case of somebody who's a new client to you, that's giving you helpful baseline information. So, what is this person able to do right now? In the case of somebody who maybe has been on your caseload for a while, it's kind of giving you an updated snapshot in time. So, it's certainly informing your treatment. And I think this is another big piece where the comprehensive part of a comprehensive assessment is really vital, because if I only have a norm reference standard score, that doesn't give me much information about what to do next and where the actual gaps are in real life at all. Um,
Right. And I think, we're going to touch on this a little bit more later in the episode, but for those of you who have not listened to the other episode related to norm referenced assessment, the culture of speech and language pathology assessment skills is very heavily reliant on using norm referenced assessments. So, in the previous episode, we reviewed a handful of studies of pieces of literature that have sampled speech and language pathology evaluative practices and found that SLPs very heavily rely on standardized measures for comprehensive assessment, even though those scores don't necessarily lead to informed treatment decisions. I mean, and we rely on them so heavily and don't really question it, to a point where, as our listener pointed out, can she even do the assessment without the standardized test, without the norm reference test? So I think the word comprehensive, sort of going back to what you were saying, is the best way to look at it, because it's not just norm referenced. It's not just standardized assessments that we are using to to come up with and create a comprehensive assessment.
And I think, norm referenced isn't bad. There are a lot of
No.
huge pluses to norm reference tools. They allow us to be productive and consistent and provide you a snapshot in a very structured manner that makes sure you don't, miss any of these components because they've all been included. They allow understanding and comparison readily across, different populations in different areas. If I receive, Kate's client and this is how they did on the self with her, I can read that as a clinician and know very much what that test process looked like, right? So there are definite pros, but I think that if you're doing a norm reference tool in isolation, you're really missing a lot of vital information. The fourth thing that comes up with assessment is that assessment also provides support for ongoing progress monitoring. And this is something to consider, where one theme that will sort of continue throughout this episode is the idea that this should be just like your treatment. It should be an individualized decision as far as what formulates your comprehensive assessment. So you may find yourself needing different tools when you're conducting a comprehensive assessment to support progress monitoring than you would for, say, initial eligibility.
And I think that, the using comprehensive assessment as a mode of ongoing progress monitoring, that can also be really influenced by your work setting. So just in comparison to, my previous jobs working in a hospital and an outpatient clinic, insurance required that I reevaluate my clients every 4 to 6 weeks. And sometimes that was, my clients who are, had more significant learning needs or learning challenges or learning differences, that I had to get very creative to measure the progress over such a short period of time. And that's very, that mode of measuring ongoing progress is very different compared to a school setting where you're measuring progress every officially evaluating progress every 3 years, but you're still doing some level of informed quote assessment, even if it's informal, to write your goals and objectives every year. But even that doing that annually is very different from, doing it every 4 to 6 weeks in a hospital setting. So this concept of continually monitoring progress can, again, huge range based on your experience and your work setting.
And to your point about that example where you're needing to reassess every 4 to 6 weeks, it would be definitely clinically inappropriate to use norm reference tools for that. You would be invalidating the test every time.
I wanted to say that would be legal. I feel like that's a speech police moment.
It is.
Right?
Yep.
Like the manual says you
can't
cannot
do it.
repeat this test within, 6 months to a year, whatever, whatever those testing procedures are. So yes, in my hospital settings, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners out there, if you're in a setting where you're being, accessing insurance and your funding source is driving your quote assessment procedures, and you need to reevaluate on an ongoing basis, you're probably not using standardized assessments every 4 to 6 weeks. So thinking about what you're doing in those moments, is it a language sample? And we're going to talk about a lot of these later on in the episode, but point being, comprehensive assessment can be a very wide range. And I think, again, the key word is comprehensive, doing your assessment to drive your clinical decision making on an individual basis.
So as a recap, when we're doing a comprehensive evaluation, it is serving multiple functions. Number one, adherence to the ASHA Code of Ethics. That's always a function. Number two, always a function.
You can't forget that.
Don't forget that, please.
Don't forget it.
Determination of eligibility for services, or informing treatment goals and approaches, or as a method of ongoing progress monitoring. So it really can be helpful as a clinician to remind yourself, why are you administering an assessment in the first place, and think about that before you even plan it. And it could be 2 of those reasons, it could be 3 of those reasons, or maybe it's all 4. So
Mm-hmm.
that's going to
Mm-hmm.
help you make the choices about what you're going to do as part of that assessment package.
And I think this is a really nice segue into our second learning objective. What is the difference between a norm referenced assessment and a criterion referenced assessment? So I feel like every single time we record one of these, I think this is why this project is so fun. I guess you could phrase it 2 ways. I don't know. I didn't know some of this. So there's always something that I don't know. It's
There's
fine.
always something to
It's not
learn.
like,
That is
yeah,
very
it's not like
true.
I've been practicing for 15 years. But I didn't know. I
You
mean,
can't
there
know
is a
everything.
very specific difference between norm referenced and criterion referenced assessments. And there was a lot of this detail that was news to me.
Well, and I think some of it doesn't, like, I don't think it matters as much that you know the definition that matches the test, but I think where it's so important is how you use these different tests, because they're different tools for different jobs, right? You don't want to
Mhm.
take your hammer to screw in, a screw. You want the screwdriver. So knowing that these are different.
Is that true?
Yes, that's true. I'm great at construction.
Good. Moving on.
Moving on. Um, so what makes a comprehensive assessment? Of course, we direct you guys to ASHA. ASHA's website has so much helpful information on there for SLPs and non-SLPs alike. For this episode, some things that we found particularly helpful were an entry on their practice portal under the clinical topics section titled Assessment Tools, Techniques, and Data Sources. And then a second entry that they had under the heading of Information for Speech Language Pathologists titled Assessment and Evaluation of Speech Language Disorders in Schools. So these are just 2 places that, if you'd like to learn more, are a great place to start, particularly the one about schools, because it's just chock full of all sorts of hyperlinks to different resources. So you can find a lot of
Oh, I
information.
love those kinds of pages. It's
Yeah.
like one, you doggy ear that page or you bookmark that
Yeah.
page. It ends up being so helpful.
So as we've already sort of talked about, a comprehensive speech and language assessment, it's not one specific thing. It's not one specific magic combination. You can't say, well, you need at least one norm referenced and a criterion referenced and throw in a dash of interview and you're good to go. It's really
Sound like somebody in the 1920s at like a rural fair. You got one of these and you got one of these.
Comprehensive assessment.
If for those of you who can't see Amy, she's twisting an imaginary mustache.
I am. So it's not that. But what it is an individualized decision that's informed by all of these different client variables and institutional variables, like we've talked about. So you really want to individualize your process, your assessment process. But some of the things that might come into play would be age, right? I mean, when we're thinking,
Huge.
For a lot of reasons, right? If we're thinking about norm reference, you may actually need to pick a different test because you have age bands. When we're thinking about less structured approaches that we'll talk more about later, you're going to want to structure those interactions differently. So that's important.
I also think, and of course, this is my ABA brain sort of, but that's when you're preparing for the assessment, you're going to prepare behavior modifications differently from a preschooler to, like, let's say a 12 or 15-year-old, right? And I think it's interesting. This is a conversation I have with my mentees a lot. It's interesting to go into an assessment because you think that you want them to perform their best. And we do want to get their best, but it's also okay if we get what's not their best, because we need to design treatment that assists an individual on a good day and a not so great day. So if you're, trying to think about planning for your comprehensive assessment and age and thinking about how you're going to set up the room, how are you going to keep the individual motivated? How are you going to give them breaks? What kinds of reinforcement are you going to provide throughout the assessment? That the age component it's going to be a huge factor there.
Yeah, it's a huge factor. Similarly, language status is a huge factor. We talked a lot in our episode focusing more on norm reference tools, but you shouldn't be using certain assessments with people who the assessment is not in their L1 and they are not dual language
L1 meaning
speakers.
first language, for
Yes.
those of you, right.
Right. Sorry, acronyms. So that's super important. Perhaps you need a translator. Perhaps you need translated materials for the people who are coming in, either to support your client or their parents or guardians. So that's really important
Or,
to know.
as we will talk about later on, maybe there are other informal assessments that are better geared towards somebody who has a diverse linguistic background.
Teaser. It's gonna get. We're gonna get some more information about
We'll
that later.
get there. We will get there. If you are evaluating somebody with culturally and linguistically diverse background, we will get there.
Yes. Sensory and motor needs. How does this person's sensory system work? How does their body work? Do you need certain modifications in that domain? What about attention? Is that going to impact your testing? That is another reason that you may choose to emphasize certain assessment approaches more than others.
And I was just about to say, so a lot of these items, sensory motor needs, attention, this is really, if you're thinking about a norm referenced assessment, or if you need to provide a norm referenced assessment because of eligibility criteria, or, any of the reasons why you would choose a norm referenced assessment, some of these individual considerations might necessitate changing the standardized assessment procedure, in which case you can't use standard scores, you can't use age equivalencies. So, what else do you need to pepper into your assessment planning if you know that this individual, because of their sensory and motor needs or attention needs, are going to need massive amounts of accommodations to the standardized protocol? High five.
Virtual high five.
Virtual high five. I love it when you agree with me. It makes me feel so validated.
Much. Yeah, that's great. I think one other piece that's really important is, what is the area or areas of concern? Like, what is your referral question? If you are in that outpatient clinic for that student who, didn't score 2.5 standard deviations below the mean, but they do have some articulation and phonological concerns, and the family, would still like them to be seen for private practice, well, then you want to make sure that you have tools available to you to specifically look at those areas. You may change and choose to use different tools as well as time goes on, but know your referral area. That's very important.
It's very important. I have found in my personal experience that the referral area and additional information, like superfluous information that comes along with the referral, will, I don't want to say cloud my decision-making process, but it can make you think of things in really different ways. I think that that's really important.
Well, and I think you make the point, right, that this definitely can be influenced by your funding source, the requirements of your institution. And within those parameters, you're still constructing an individualized and comprehensive assessment. And something, I think it is important to highlight that some of these things, these data sources, might change through your assessment. So perhaps that child comes in and, the school SLP maybe gave a note to the family and they say, okay, we think that he's fronting and he's having trouble with some of these sounds. But in the course of conducting that assessment and looking at the articulation and phonology piece, you notice that it seems like there maybe could be some receptive language deficits. So then there's a conversation about any additional testing or different measures that you might want to do to look at that piece as well in order to provide a comprehensive assessment. It's not always limited to the initial referral question.
The one that comes to my mind as an example, that I have seen most often being in private practice and working in an outpatient setting, is that my referral source is often the family. And often they have a child who they know is in need of services, but they're getting a second opinion. They don't agree with the school speech pathologist. They don't agree with the pediatrician. And so, you may go into that assessment thinking, okay, they're concerned about X, Y, and Z, but I have another professional who has given an opinion. And now I really need to either think about the counseling that I'm going to be doing before or after, or, the interview or collaborating. I really need to talk to that other professional first. So I think, again, just to highlight that, the referral source can really drive so much of how you're thinking about your assessment.
That's such a good point. So to recap, norm referenced assessments aren't bad. They have their place, and their place is to help you compare and rank your clients relative to similarly aged and statistically validated cohorts. So they are telling you about performance compared to this normative sample, and they have relatively low ecological validity, right? So
Can you take the word ecological validity and say it in
other
Kate
words.
language?
No,
Say it in a way that I can understand. Because
I
I do
found this
understand
word
what
when
it
I was
means.
reading. I didn't like, I just read it. Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
So tell us, when you say ecological validity,
Yes,
I can ask the internet.
you could, and we'll see who's faster. Go. So ecological validity is really talking about translating those skills into real life situations, right? So when we think about norm referenced assessments and them not having great ecological validity, what we're really saying is that the information that we get from those tools doesn't really tell us about how our client can use those skills functionally. It doesn't
Mhm.
tell us about environmental variables that might affect that performance, right? So it's not telling us, like, oh, if it's super structured, he does a great job with these skills, but get into a busy and distracting environment and it looks very different. The norm reference assessments aren't giving us that type of detail. They're also not telling us about strategies, right? Because in most cases, they're the use of strategies or any modifications like that will invalidate your results. So it's not telling you unless
Got
you're
it.
kind of probing afterwards. It's not saying, oh, you know what? It was really hard to generate an utterance about how these ideas are semantically related. But if I used visuals or if I did this other thing, it was fine. Because if you do that, it's no longer the standardized result that you're looking for.
Got it. Thank you for that dictionary moment.
It was good. It was fun.
I
Thanks for that.
appreciate it.
So that brings us to criterion reference, right? So they're still standardized, but instead of comparing against this bigger, broader sample, what a criterion reference tool is doing is helping you compare your client's performance against a specific set of criteria. So they are giving you information about mastery of skills.
So this is the part that I didn't know. Well, I think at one point I knew it.
Bet you
I
did.
learned it in graduate
Bet you
school,
did.
but then I forgot it because of medium long in the tooth, to use your words. I've been using that phrase a lot
Because it's good.
recently because it's a good one. I guess more recently was under the impression that a criterion referenced assessment was not standardized.
And that is not wrong. That is not a wrong impression. So criterion referenced assessments are a little bit tricky because they can be standardized or non-standardized. But
Okay, that makes me feel better.
but when they're standardized, it's going to say that in the administration manual, right? So when you get your assessment and you open it up and you read about administering it, it will say right in there, this is a criterion referenced assessment. So some that I have used, some criterion reference assessments that I personally have used would be the Rossetti Infant Toddler Language Scale, the VB Map, the Augmentative and Alternative Communication Profile. Like these are tools that are super structured, but they're not giving you a standard score. They're giving you usually some score in relationship to all sorts of different skills. As a clinician, I love these tools.
Oh yeah, I love these. I love these. I'm thinking of other ones off the top of my head, like the functional communication profile.
I don't know if that might be more of a checklist.
The functional. I'm going to ask the internet.
I don't use it
Hold
as
on to your seats.
I use it like a
Everyone.
checklist. And I think that
It's a challenge.
that's something good to mention too. If something is a criterion reference tool, you don't necessarily have to use it as a criterion reference tool. You might use it as a skills inventory. You might not report, you know what, Kate got a score of this out of this on this section. You might just use it clinically for your planning and your treatment. You might say, you know, I really like the information that this one subsection of the VB map tells me. And so I'm going to use that one little piece to get the specific information to inform my treatment.
So the internet says, drum roll please, the functional communication profile is criterion referenced.
Ooh, good find.
I know. What would we do without
You
the
win.
internet?
Good job.
But what would we do without it? I would just go on knowing like and doing all of the wrong things all the time. But anyway, so I love these tools. Criterion referenced assessments, I think, are one of the most, I can't say that they're underused, but they're not the most obvious choice. And I think you make such a good point that when you use a criterion reference tool, you don't necessarily have to use it as it is intended. You can use it as a guided interview. You can, use it to collect information and guide your thinking or guide your practice. I'm not sure that that's the way the authors intended for you to use these tools, but you can certainly use them that way when you are, making individualized assessment decisions for a quality assessment for a specific set of needs.
And I think if the listeners would like to learn more, one interesting article that does talk a lot about criterion reference measures is an article titled Familiar Strangers, Criterion Reference Measures in Communication Disorders by Rebecca McCauley.
Can we just
And
pause
so
for 1 second and talk about how that's the best article title of all time?
it's so good, right?
Familiar
It's so
Strangers.
good.
I want someone to write a song called Familiar Strangers. Or
Well,
that's like a whole category of people you know in your life, right? Like they're a familiar stranger. It's genius. Go
it's
on.
really good. Maybe this is her version of a song. This is her song about assessment methods. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you very much. But she talks a lot about it. So if you would like to get deep into it and kind of the merits of the different assessment measures, that's a great place to check out.
Okay.
Okay.
So wait, go ahead.
Sorry, connected with that, for people who are working in schools, there's a number of curriculum referenced assessments out there as well. So similar to criterion referenced assessments for speech and language, these measures are comparing a student's skills against specific curriculum skills. And it's a structured way. You can gain information about where a student is in terms of their mastery of specific skills linked to an area of the curriculum.
Now, this was another learning moment for me. I had never heard the term curriculum referenced assessments. Can you
But
please tell me what that is?
But you probably know them, right? So you've probably heard of them, seen
I
them
love
be
it when you
used.
say this to me. You try and
You
give
just
me
you
more
just
credit than I'm deserving of.
you just
That's
don't know the
fine.
name for it. I mean, this would be if you were we use them a lot in public schools looking at a child's reading level, right? And the educator administers over the course of a school year different reading assessments, the same assessment over and over and over again, to gain information about what literacy skills the student does or doesn't have. It can be helpful for placing students in instructional groups. A challenge with all of these criterion referenced or curriculum reference tools is just to make sure that because they're not as standardized as a standardized message, we're thinking about informal measures, a challenge of informal measures like non-standardized curriculum reference and non-standardized criterion reference tools. The plus is that they don't have this rigid administration, but the minus is that there's potential for more bias and inconsistency in reporting and scoring.
I think that's probably something that also is not considered. Just that there, just because you have a measure doesn't mean that there isn't room for error. There's always room for error when you're using any kind of assessment measure. I think that is a good segue into our third and final learning objective. Last but not least, identify at least 3 components that should be considered within a comprehensive assessment. Now, this I'm very interested in because I had never thought of comprehensive assessments as countable factors or with countable components. So tell me everything.
Well, I don't know all the things. We just know the things
You
that
know
we've
a
read
lot of the
about.
things.
We know medium things. But I would say we've covered some of these things that could be a component, right? So we've talked about standardized tests that are norm referenced. We've talked about standardized tests that are criterion referenced. We've talked about informal criterion reference measures. We've talked about curriculum reference measures. And those are helping us paint the picture of what our client needs and possibly answering other questions about eligibility and all these other things.
But I think
And
it's safe to assume, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. So,
do it.
all of those things, just recapping, all of those things are very structured, whether it's norm referenced, criterion referenced, standardized, whatever, they're all very structured components. And that's only a portion. Like, there's a whole other world of informal assessment measures out there.
Yeah, there is. And
Right?
when we think about the information that we get from the measures that we've talked about thus far, That's a lot of information that helps us paint a picture about what a client can and maybe can't do. But what we know about writing quality goals and objectives and meaningful goals and objectives is that those goals and objectives aren't just about those things. They're about connecting those things and anchoring them on to other meaningful components in that client's life, right? So if you're an outpatient, it's also really important that you have input from the parent or guardian as far as, what their priorities are in terms of
Hmm.
goals. So what we've talked about so far gives us really helpful information about what we might think clinically are solid places to move next, but we still don't have any information about those other stakeholders. We don't have, in the case of a school-based person, we don't have information about what that child looks like in the classroom, or what skills are highly correlated with the curriculum. We might have some if we've done some of a curriculum assessment, but usually that's done by the teacher anyway. So, and we don't know much at all about how people are using their language across multiple environments, right? So that brings us to all of these really interesting informal measures. And I think we can start with interviews and checklists. Love them.
I love them. I find that interviews are a crucial component of my assessment process.
Hmm.
And
I would agree.
I know before we started recording, we had an interesting conversation about what constitutes an interview. So I had a mentee, shout out to you, SB, you know who you are. I had a mentee recently ask me, okay, I'm helping her work through one of her first AAC evals. And she said to me, okay, so which interview form should I use? Do you have an interview form or like an interview, I guess, assessment? What's the word I'm looking for? An interview structure that I should use. And my face must have been a deer in headlights. I was like, I don't have one. And it really made me second guess how I do interviews, how I was supposed to teach her how to do an interview. And so again, we have this really wide spectrum of what constitutes a quality comprehensive assessment or a quality comprehensive interview. So for me clinically, I do a lot of thinking online. My questions change based on the answers. There's a lot of consultative, interactive communication happening. And there are informal interview structures out there that are also really helpful. So, and I think that it's okay to do, at least I hope it's okay. There might be a listener out there that's like, that lady really should be using a better form. Well, I admitted it. I don't have one. I interview myself using my clinical skills. And it sort of reminds me of an article we referenced in the last podcast related to written by a woman named Tina Eichstadt. I'm really trying. I just over Germanized that maybe. Ickstadt. She wrote an article for the ASHA Leader called "The Best Assessment Ever." You. So in this article, she sort of talks about how we as clinicians have a lot of training. And in the article, she encourages you to, quote, free yourself from the standard protocol, which was quote from page one. The article was published in 2016. The reference is on our website. And I think it's okay sometimes to use your own clinical judgment when you are conducting. I'm basically just justifying the fact that I don't use the standardized protocol when I conducted the interview. But I think it's really okay to use your clinical judgment when you're doing some of these informal measures like interviews. And I guess checklists are a little bit different, but interviews, observations, language samples, all those kinds of things, which we'll get to in a minute.
Well, and I would agree that I think it really is a combination, just like everything else. You're making clinical judgments based upon what you know about your client and their needs and all of those different variables that we talked about earlier to figure out, would a checklist be helpful? In the schools, people use a lot of checklists because it can be a helpful way to communicate with multiple stakeholders at once, right? So that can be helpful.
So true.
Um, if you're working with people, thinking about classroom teachers, it might be helpful for them to get accustomed to some different consistent checklists that people use, because then moving forward, when they fill them out for future students, it won't feel so different for them. Like, oh, I'm familiar with this. I filled this thing out before. I know what these questions are asking about. I enjoy using checklists as interviews a lot of the time, because then if questions come up, it's nice to be there to help talk the other person through it.
So, full disclosure, when my mentee asked me which interview structured interview she should use, I gave her some checklists.
Yeah.
I admitted I did not have a formal process, but there are all of these other checklists and criterion referenced assessments out there, and I gave her a couple of them to sort of, these might help you jog your memory, these might help guide your interview process, and I think that those are great tools, especially if you don't necessarily have a lot of experience interviewing, or you're in a situation where you're not really sure what's going to happen, or you're feeling a little insecure about how the interview is going to go. Grab a couple checklists, grab a couple standardized test forms to help jog your memory and help you think of good digging clinical questions.
Well, and it can be, it can also be really nice because when you have a permanent product like a checklist, that's something that could be potentially translated. It may be available in a different language, making it more accessible to a broader number of clientele. It could be something that you use in conjunction with a translator to help talk through the different questions of the interview. And that can be nice too, because if you have a translated checklist, you can share it with your translator in advance, who very well might not be a speech language pathologist. So it helps them kind of frame what the interview process might look like. So I think that a number of variables, just like everything else in the comprehensive assessment process, should come into play when you're making determinations. I do have sort of a graphic organizer that I personally use, that I've developed over time, that's sort of organized using the set framework because I love it. Shout out Joy the Bala. Just to make sure, more as a memory aid for me. So I make sure I don't get back to my office and realize, oh no, I forgot to ask this thing. I really do
Yeah.
want to make sure I ask everybody. Um,
That is one
Sometimes,
drawback to not having a form, is that happens. That does
oh
happen to me all the
yeah,
time. But in my work setting, I have access to everyone. So when I think of those
right,
questions, I can, but that's not always the case in different
right.
work settings. Um, I wanted to sort of skip ahead so to two or three of the other things, because I had some questions about them. So in terms of informal assessment measures, there's interviews, checklists. Observation, I think, is another one that's a little bit more straightforward. So I'm not sure. Do you
So
disagree?
I think it's relatively straightforward, but I think that, like everything else, it's helpful to be mindful about the type of observation you're doing and why and when you're doing it. Right.
True.
So you might do an observation that is simulating something else, right? So say I come in and I observe during speech language pathologist pragmatics group, right? It's a small group, it's structured, it's kind of like being in class, but it's not quite like being in class. So being aware that, okay, I observed this one thing, not necessarily a direct analog to what this individual might look like in a class of 30 people, or, when you're doing a different type of group work. Um, I think that there's also,
You bring up a good point, though, and as soon as that came out of my mouth, because it's like saying, and this is how it all ties back to your referral source and your interview. Johnny has problems with social pragmatics, and you observe him in a dyad. Well, that's just not
I mean,
social skills.
it's information, it's
Right.
helpful information, but I think for me, the bigger piece around observation is to be aware of the different variables that are at play when you're doing your observations. I mean, there's also the reality, which is we have a finite period of time and funding and all of these things. So you're not going to be able to go along for your outpatient kid's whole day in kindergarten and see how that goes for him and make some
Right.
helpful recommendations. That's not the structure within which we operate here, in the United States anyway. So maybe just being aware and seeing, can I get little video clips, maybe of a couple of different moments of a couple of different types of activities. Maybe just try and get a sampling. Be aware that it's not like a perfect
And I think that's
representation.
especially true now, recording in 2020 with this whole asynchronous teletherapy model, or just teletherapy in general, maximizing those asynchronous videos, of, you can't be on the classroom, you can't be in the group, you can't, and having someone videotape many different conditions under which certain things happen.
Yeah, and I think one last point about that is also just the difference between, when we're thinking pediatric speech and language, the difference between social use of language, academic use of language, um, using language to engage in more nuanced conversation. Those are all different things. So just be sure that you're aware that all those variables are at play when you're doing your observation.
So the question I was going to ask before you hijacked and
Sorry,
took us to
hijacked.
observation land.
I did.
It's
I did.
okay. The question I was going to ask was about language samples. So
Yeah.
in the literature that we reviewed, there was in the literature that we reviewed for our last episode that talked about the culture and common evaluative practices of speech and language pathologists. The two articles found that speech and language pathologists mostly relied on the results of standardized measures, but the second in line was language samples.
Mhm.
So it seems as though language samples are a very commonly used informal evaluative measure. And yet again, we have this very wide spectrum of what constitutes a quote language sample. And I think it's so my question was, what are your thoughts on the whole on that spectrum of language samples in terms of, the on the one hand there's a specific protocol for taking a language sample for an MLU. You collect your 100 utterances and you follow the formula, which I can't remember off the top of my head. And then on the other hand, you have someone who maybe isn't capable of generating 100 utterances because they're an emergent communicator, and you've written down like the 5 words that they said in a 10-minute period. So what are your thoughts on that spread?
I think part of why language sample, like, that doesn't surprise me what the article said as far as norm reference standardized assessments and language samples being most heavily used, particularly in schools, because when you think about what the norm referenced assessment gives you, that gives you eligibility information, it gives you relative to a normative sample, but it doesn't, as we said before, it doesn't really address that ecological validity, right? It doesn't tell
There's
me,
that big word again.
right? It's so fancy bringing it back. It doesn't tell me what it looks like in real life, right? What any so language samples can really help with that. Language
Mhm.
samples can tell you a bit more about, how your client is actually using language, and they're structured, right? So back to thinking about when you're trying to maximize time, productivity, all of those things, structure does help. It keeps you from
Mhm.
wasting some time. They're repeatable, so it's nice because you can show change over time. Back to another reason why we might do a comprehensive assessment. So they check a lot of those boxes. Um, and I think we have a couple of references that we'll put up on the website. The one that I would, if you were going to pick one, the one that I would suggest you pick is titled The Clinical Utility of Language Samples by Amy Costanza Smith. Um, and I mean, all of them are going to be helpful, but she talks quite a bit about some of those points that you were raising exactly. And she cites other research. The length is, yeah, in there they say like 50 utterances is like adequate, or some term
There's a
like that.
formula. It's a
Yeah, but
thing.
100 is preferred. And she raises a lot of points that you just want to be mindful of, just like you would in an observation. Like, what do you really want to look at? So, do you want to look at conversation? Do you want to look at play? Do you want to look at narrative, interview? Like, what are the components that you want to see from your client? And a cool thing in this article, she raises the point that different contexts do tend to yield different results. So you might see increased frequency of utterances with some type of tasks, but more complexity of utterance with others. So that might lead you, similar to the observations, to say, oh, you know what, I'm just going to get a little sample of all of these different types of things.
Well, and
Um,
I think that is such it's a huge, huge distinction between different contexts in which you measure language. And a language sample is not just a language sample. You have to qualify when you're reporting on a language sample, you have to qualify the conditions under which that language sample was taken. And I think that in my experience in mentoring people and working with a lot of graduate students, that can really be it's very easy to overlook it. I'm the first to admit that I make mistakes. I say that on here all the time. But if you don't qualify what the conditions under which you took that language sample, you are not you're not reporting on valid data, right? You're not reporting on accurate communication skills. So, for example, if you want to report on independent utterances during a structured task, please make sure that you're not using a whole scaffold of prompting methods during that unstructured task, because then you're not reporting on independent language productions. If measuring the responses when you're providing prompting is important to that individual, then definitely do it and report on it. You just have to make sure that you're using the language sample to measure the context in which that is important for the client in terms of measurement.
Definitely. And I think that you want to be clear about how you're using it, why you're using it. Um, I think one other piece to just be aware of that can make it a challenge is recording. You need to understand privacy rules and confidentiality around recording. Are you allowed to record your clients? Getting informed consent, having a plan for storing that media or deleting that media is important. Those are like weird nitty gritty nuts and bolts. But definitely important to just consider when you're doing it. There are things like, if you remember back to grad school, like SALT and Child, and like these online programs that will let you analyze your data.
I don't know what that is.
It's like you just type it all in. You type it all in, and it runs all of these different.
Somebody can write in and explain to me with me, or you can tell me when we're done recording. But we only have a couple minutes left, and I wanted to get to our last component, which is, I think, very important, which is dynamic assessments. But first, before we talk about dynamic assessments, just to recap quickly from objective number 3, identify at least 3 components that should be considered within a comprehensive assessment. So there's a whole lot of informal assessment measures that you can use: interviews, checklists, observations, language samples, reporting on the context in which all data was taken, analysis of any of those language samples, mean length of utterance. We've sort of touched on all of those components. And dynamic assessment is one of them. Dynamic assessment is a massive field. It's not necessarily a field all on its own, but it's a massive body of literature. We are not going to go into it in detail here because we have no time. We do have a handful of really of good starting points for literature that listeners can go to the website and read if you would like to learn more. But what's important to know about dynamic assessments are, and we referenced this earlier in the literature, dynamic assessments are the recommended way to evaluate students who are not represented in a normative sample. So if you have, and this is specifically for culturally and linguistically diverse students. So if you are evaluating a culturally and linguistically diverse student whose first language or is not English, or they're bilingual, and they are not represented in the normative sample of the test that you need to give. And again, harking back to our previous episode, know your tests, read the manual, know know the population that was in that normative sample. Then dynamic assessment is the recommended way to move forward with that assessment. We found a great article about dynamic assessments by Lynette, I believe her last name is Austin, titled Dynamic Assessments, Whys and Hows. It was published in Perspectives in School-Based Issues in 2010. If you're interested in using dynamic assessments, or you want to learn more about dynamic assessments, this is the article that you should read. Again, it is called Dynamic Assessment, Whys and Hows by Lynette, and I believe her last name is Austin, but there's a typo in my notes.
Now our references have, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So the two of the main sort of overarching themes of dynamic assessment that I took away from this article was that there are two types of dynamic assessment. One is a test, teach, retest type, and the other is a graduated prompting format. The article goes through these two methods of dynamic assessment in depth, and it will definitely give you some good cornerstones and for implementing this type of assessment based on your student and your student or client. There are different benefits to to the two different dynamic assessment approaches. I also think this article is a really good leaping off point for finding another article if this is something that you are needing to work through in your caseload, or something that you are interested in and want to learn more about. So it's a really good one, and you should go check it out to read more. And I think that's sort of, that's all we've got.
That's all we've got. I mean, I think we covered a lot today, and I think for me the big takeaway is just knowing that It's not that certain methods are superior to others. It's that certain methods are better suited in conjunction with other methods to tell you the information that you need to know to achieve your goals for assessing the person in the first place.
Right. And I think in terms of planning and preparing for a comprehensive assessment, it is this complex interaction between all of these factors. So you have your referral source, identified areas of need, information you collect from a client history or an interview, and those components are interacting with whether or not you need to use a norm referenced assessment, whether or not a norm referenced assessment is appropriate, and what other informal measures, criterion referenced measures, do you need to incorporate in order to really make sure that your assessment is thorough and appropriate and fits in with your work setting, frankly. I mean, there's a lot of situations. I remember I worked in the hospital, I would have complex cases, and they would say, okay, you've got 45 minutes to evaluate this individual. And that was all I was going to get. So assessment is a really complex process. I think that creating a comprehensive assessment within those restrictions and within those interactions is also really complex. But we hope you took something away from today. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out. Head over to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com, to purchase your certificate of attendance if you are using this episode for ASHA certification maintenance hours. If you listened in your car or folding laundry, there are handouts available for $1. And if you enjoyed today's episode and don't need a certificate or a handout but would like to support our work, please cruise on over to our website and you can buy us a cup of coffee. That's even how it's listed. So reach out to us anytime, info@slpnerdcast.com. And thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, guys. Never